Okay, let's now take a look at how we can register a new user to our application. And to do that, we are going to be creating a new API controller. So inside the Solution Explorer, let's just right-click the controllers folder and we'll say Add New File, and we'll create an account controller. And if you forget to specify class before typing the name, I do that quite a lot, just Control A, Control X, the name, then select class, then paste in the name of the controller again, and then press return, and it will create a new class. Now I think I've done it already. I created my base API controller and I did not update the namespace. And like I mentioned before, this is not a physical namespace, it's a logical one. So even though this doesn't match the folder name that this is inside of, nothing broke in my application. But what we can do, of course, is give it the namespace of API controllers, and that would be more consistent with how other tools create new classes in C#. So I will try and remember it, but please do expect me every now and again to forget to update this as well. And then inside our users controller, note that we've got an error now because the base API controller could not be found. And it asks us, are we missing a using directive? Well, yes we are, because we need to tell this class, and I've done it also in the users controller class. So in fact, just as an example here, then because our base API controller is in the controller's namespace, then one way to fix this, or two ways to fix this actually, we can either use the quick fix and bring in using API controllers, which is imported at the top. That would be one way. Or the more correct way would be to specify the correct namespace, and our controllers are going to be inside of the API.controllers namespace. Then because these classes both reside in the API controllers namespace, that would be the alternative way to resolve that issue. And let's just check the weather forecast controller, and because this already had the API controllers namespace, we don't need to change anything in there. Okay. And for our account controller, let's also give this the namespace of API controllers as well. And then we can just derive from the base API controller in here. So let's create a new endpoint to register a user. Now this is going to be an HTTP post. So we specify the HTTP post attribute, and we're going to specify a root parameter of, in quotes, just register. So to get to this endpoint, it's going to be account, as in the name of the controller, without the word controller, and then / register. That's how we get to this endpoint from our client. And then we'll say public async task, and we're going to be returning an action result from this method. And for the time being, we're going to return the app user after the user has successfully registered. And then we'll give this method a name of register. And for the time being, I'm going to say that we want to receive as parameters to this method the string of the username and the string of the password when using this endpoint. Now, as I mentioned, we're not going to store the passwords in clear text, and we do need to encrypt them in some way. So let's write some code to do that. Now I'm going to say using var hmac equals new hmac SHA-512, which we can use to encrypt some text or use a hashing algorithm to encrypt some text so it's not stored in clear text. But I've used something we haven't used before, and this using statement. And if we look at its description, this releases all resources used by the current instance of the hash algorithm class. And it's going to call the hash algorithm dispose method. Now we're not injecting this class into our controller. We're just using it inside a method, which means the framework itself isn't going to instantiate this. In fact, it's not, because we're calling the new method to create a new instance of this class for our usage. Which means when it comes to disposing of this class, well, we've got two choices. We can either not use the using statement and just declare the variable which is using this class, and then at some point in the future, .NET garbage collection will come along and clean up any resources that we have not disposed of. That would be one way, but we don't have control over the garbage collector. Another way to do this, which is the better way, is to use this using statement, and once this class is out of scope, as in it's not being used anymore, then the dispose method will be called and it will be disposed of. So now we have this available, let's go and use it. So we're going to say var user equals a new app user. And then we can initialize the properties of the new thing that we're creating. So we open curly brackets to do this. And we're going to specify a username equal to the username that we're passing in as a parameter to our register endpoint. And then we need to deal with the password hash and the password salt. So we'll say password hash equals, and then we'll use hback, and this has a method inside it called compute hash. So we'll utilize this. And then this compute hash method takes a byte array. So we need to create a byte array from the password that's been passed in here. And one way we can do that is by using text encoding. So we can say encoding, and we get this from system.text. So do double check you've got the correct using statement inside your class. And then we can say UTF-8, and then we can say get bytes, and then we can pass in the password that the user has provided. Now we also want to use a sorting function as well, so that we scramble the already hashed password hash, so that each user, even if they use the same password, each password hash would be different as well. Fairly standard to do this, because then if our database does get compromised, then each different user is going to have a different password hash, even if they're using the same password. So we'll specify password salt, and we can use the hmac.key to salt our password. And we'll close this statement with a semicolon. And we need to use our data context inside here. We need to add this user to the database. So we'll use the primary constructor once again. So at the top, after the account controller, we'll just add parentheses and then say data context and specify context. And then we can use our context and say context.users.add and then pass in the user. And then in order to save this into our database, we need to use the await context and save changes async method from Entity Framework. Once we've saved our user into the database, we can then return the user that we have just created. Now there's a few things going on here. We've got the account controller that's deriving from our base API controller, and one of the features of the API controller attribute is auto binding to parameters in our controller. So we've got two parameters in our controller, and there's a number of different ways we can pass this information in an HTTP request. We can use HTTP headers. We can use the body of the HTTP request. We can also use query string parameters. And depending on the type of information or the types that are stored in here, then the API controller attribute is going to automatically bind to the parameters, and we're going to take a look at an example of that because it does depend. And in order for this account controller to actually do anything, then we do need to restart our application, because whenever we add a new controller, we need to do this. And in fact, if we look at our terminal, then it's telling us that, yeah, we're going to need to restart our app. So I'm just going to stop it completely and then say .NET watch and press return. And once this has started, we'll go to Postman and we'll do some testing. So once it has started, let's go across to Postman, and we've got a couple of different register user requests here. This register user is passing the information in the body of the HTTP request. And this one currently will not work. And if I click send, then it's going to tell us that we've got validation errors. It tells us the password is required and the username is required. And we're passing the username and password, but because of the way that we've specified the parameters in our API controller, it can't read them yet. We'd need to tell it where to get these from. But what it will read correctly is if we use the query string approach. So instead of using the body of the request to pass the parameters in, we instead use a query string. So after the register, we have a question mark, and then we've got the username equals Sam, and the password equals password. And this is using the query parameters to pass up this information. Now, because of the API attribute, this one will work. So if I click send, then we send a par request. We've got the username Sam, we've got a password hash that's been created, and a password salt. And the reason that just worked is because of the API controller attribute. If we have our parameters as just plain strings, then it knows where to get the information from. If we need to tell our controller because it cannot do so, then we do have the option to give our parameters a hint. So for example, for the string of the username, we could say this is coming from the query string, or we can use from body. And then it would go and look in the body of the request for the username and password. But there's a better approach to doing this. Rather than providing the hints and telling our API controller to look in the body, we'll stick with conventions, and if we pass these parameters as an object, then it's going to default to looking inside the body of the request. And we'll take a look at how we do that next.